For 18 years, nobody had heard music coming from Walter Bennett's cabin. Then, during the worst storm Blackwater Lake had seen in years, Eleanor Bennett's melody began playing inside it. The cabin had no electricity. Its windows had been boarded shut since 2008. Its door had remained locked for nearly 2 decades. And Walter Bennett, the only man who might have explained what happened, was lying in a hospital bed 7 miles away. That was why people started talking. Not because they believed in ghosts, because there was no obvious explanation. The first person to hear the melody was Frank Dawson. At 79, Frank had spent most of his life along the shores of Blackwater Lake. He knew its sounds better than most people knew the streets of their own town. He knew the sound of spring rain moving across the water, fishing boats leaving before sunrise, winter ice cracking along the shoreline. But shortly after 9 that night, he heard something he had never heard there before. Music. At first, Frank thought the storm was playing tricks on him. The wind was strong enough to make the trees groan and the windows rattle. Then the melody came again. Soft, clear, unmistakable. Frank stepped onto his covered porch and listened. The sound drifted across the lake, weaving through the rain and wind. Then he recognized it. Eleanor Bennett. For years, Eleanor had played that melody at birthdays, anniversaries, and family gatherings. Some people remembered the tune. Others remembered the woman who played it. Most remembered both. Frank stood motionless as rain blew sideways across his yard. The melody continued, not perfectly, not continuously, but clearly enough to recognize. A porch light came on 2 houses down, then another. A neighbor stepped outside beneath his awning, listening toward the lake. A few minutes later, someone called Frank from across the road. "You're hearing that too?" Frank looked toward Walter's cabin. Yes. Within the hour, several neighbors had heard it, and every one of them pointed toward the same place. Walter's cabin. The cabin nobody entered anymore. The cabin that had remained sealed since Eleanor's death. The cabin that should have been silent, yet somehow wasn't. By sunrise, the entire town was talking about it. The diner buzzed with theories. Some blamed teenagers, others suspected trespassers. A few insisted someone had hidden a speaker inside. Nobody agreed on an explanation. Everyone agreed on one thing. The music had come from Walter's cabin, and nobody could explain why. By afternoon, the story had traveled beyond Blackwater County. Eventually, it reached Michael Bennett. He was sitting in a conference room 300 miles away when his phone vibrated. Frank Dawson. The name alone surprised him. They hadn't spoken in years. Michael stepped into the hallway and answered. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. When it ended, he stood staring at the phone in his hand. The melody, the storm, the cabin, his father. 4 things he never expected to hear mentioned together again. For nearly 18 years, Michael had avoided thinking about Blackwater Lake whenever he could. He had built a different life, a different routine, a future that didn't require looking back. Yet hearing Eleanor's name still had the power to stop him cold. That evening, he packed a bag and started driving home. Not because he believed the story, because he needed to understand why it had happened. At Blackwater Lake, someone else was thinking about the melody. Emily Bennett, Walter's granddaughter. At 27, Emily had inherited Walter's patience and Eleanor's curiosity. It made her unusually good at noticing things other people overlooked, and almost incapable of ignoring a mystery connected to her family. Shortly after sunrise, the hospital called. Walter wanted to see her immediately. The request alone felt unusual. Walter rarely asked anyone for anything. He had spent much of his younger life in the Army, where silence, observation, and patience had often mattered more than words. Even after leaving the service, those habits had stayed with him. When Emily entered his room, she found him sitting beside the window, watching rain slide down the glass. He seemed to be waiting, not for the weather to pass, for something else. "You heard about the cabin?" Emily asked. Walter nodded. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he opened the bedside drawer and removed an old brass key. Emily frowned. She had never seen it before. Walter turned it once in his fingers before placing it in her hand. "If Michael comes home," he said quietly, "you'll know what to do." Emily looked down at the key. "What does that mean?" Walter turned his gaze back toward the rain. The conversation was over. Typical Walter. One answer. 3 new questions. Emily almost smiled. Then she noticed something she had never seen in him before. He looked nervous, not frightened, not confused, nervous, as though something long buried had finally begun to move, and he wasn't entirely sure where it would lead. Michael arrived the following morning. The town looked almost exactly as he remembered. The church still overlooked Main Street. The diner still sat beside the gas station. The lake still stretched beyond the trees. Only the people had changed, and so had he. His first stop wasn't the cabin. It was the hospital. Walter looked older than Michael expected. Age had softened some of the sharpness Michael remembered from his childhood. But there was still something familiar in the way his father watched the room before speaking. Old habits. Old discipline. For a moment, neither man spoke. Too much history sat between them. Too many unanswered questions. Finally, Michael pulled a chair closer. "I heard about the storm." Walter nodded. The whole town heard about the storm. The music came from the cabin. Another nod. Michael studied him carefully. "You know anything about that?" Walter's eyes drifted toward the window. Rainwater moved slowly down the glass. Michael waited. Then he asked the question everyone else had been asking. "How could music come from a locked cabin?" Walter looked directly at him. For the first time since Michael had entered the room, there was something different in his expression. Then he asked a question of his own. "What melody?" Michael froze. The words weren't confused. They weren't surprised. They sounded cautious, as though Walter knew there was more than one answer Michael might have given. Michael stared at him. Walter said nothing, and suddenly the question mattered more than the music itself, because his father wasn't asking what had happened. He seemed to be asking which melody Michael had heard. A chill moved through Michael. For the first time, he wondered whether Walter already knew exactly what had happened at the cabin. That afternoon, Michael drove to the lake. The cabin stood exactly where he remembered it, hidden among trees, facing the water, waiting. From a distance, it looked abandoned, but the closer Michael got, the less abandoned it seemed. The boards covering the windows remained intact. The lock still hung on the front door. Nothing appeared damaged. Nothing appeared disturbed. There was no sign that anyone had entered. Yet the memory of the music refused to leave his mind. Behind him, tires crunched over gravel. Emily stepped out of her truck. She was holding something in her hand, the brass key. Michael looked from the key to the cabin and back again. "Where did you get that?" "Grandpa." "When?" "Yesterday." Michael frowned. Yesterday. Before anyone knew he was coming home. Before anyone knew the cabin would be opened. Before any of this. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Not fear. Expectation. As though Walter had been waiting for this moment long before the storm arrived. Emily looked toward the cabin, then back at Michael. "You ready?" Michael stared at the weathered structure. The cabin where Eleanor's melody had somehow returned. The cabin his father had kept closed for nearly 2 decades. "No," he admitted. Emily gave him a small smile. "Good." Michael looked at her. "Good? It means we're asking the right questions." Together they walked toward the door. Neither of them noticed the narrow vents beneath the roofline, half hidden by years of weather and shadow. Neither understood yet why Eleanor had spent so much time studying the cabin's walls, its openings, and the way the wind moved through them. and neither realized that before the week was over, Michael would discover that the mystery had never really been about how the music returned. It was about why one family had spent 18 years living inside the same misunderstanding. The brass key felt heavier than it looked. Michael noticed it the moment he took it from Emily, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. For 18 years, Walter Bennett had kept the cabin closed to everyone. Now, without offering an explanation, he had finally allowed Emily to bring the key back. Michael still didn't understand why, but he knew one thing. Walter had expected them to use it. The old lock resisted when Michael turned the key. Years of weather had stiffened the mechanism, and for several seconds the key barely moved. Then the lock gave way. A metallic click echoed through the quiet morning. Neither Michael nor Emily spoke. Michael pushed the door open. The hinges groaned. A narrow strip of sunlight entered the dark cabin, and for the first time in 18 years, someone stepped inside. The first thing Michael noticed was what wasn't there. Dust, decay, the smell of a place that had been forgotten. He had expected all of it. Instead, the cabin felt preserved, not abandoned. There was a difference. An abandoned place felt as though nobody cared what happened to it. This place felt as though someone had been waiting for the right moment to return. The furniture remained where it had always been. Books still filled the shelves. A quilt was folded across the sofa. A coffee mug rested beside the stone fireplace. Even the piano stood beneath its old cover, untouched. Emily walked slowly through the room. "This isn't what I expected." "Neither did I," Michael said. For years, he had imagined the cabin as a monument to Walter's grief, a place he had sealed because returning was too painful. But standing inside it now, Michael began to wonder if he had misunderstood his father. Maybe Walter hadn't sealed the cabin because he wanted to forget. Maybe he had sealed it because there was something inside he wasn't willing to let disappear. Michael looked around the room. Then what was he protecting? Emily didn't answer. She didn't seem to know. But she had already started toward the piano. She stopped beside it. A faint smile crossed her face. "You remember this place?" Michael asked. Emily ran her fingers across the polished wood. "Grandma used to bring me here." Michael looked at her. "You came here?" "When I was little." She smiled at the memory. "She taught me a melody." Michael's expression changed. "The melody from the storm?" Emily nodded. "I recognized it the moment I heard it." That answer unsettled him more than he expected. The music from the storm wasn't some random sound produced by an old building. Eleanor had known the melody. She had taught it to Emily, which meant the sound had a history. Michael glanced toward the walls. For the first time, the cabin seemed less like an old family property and more like something Eleanor had deliberately shaped. He remembered what Emily had said about the melody. Then he noticed something beside the piano bench, a small brass instrument. Emily picked it up carefully. It was unlike anything either of them had seen before. It wasn't a compass. It wasn't a watch. It wasn't a conventional measuring instrument. It looked handmade, with narrow sections of brass fitted together with unusual precision. Some areas had been polished smooth by years of handling. Others remained dark with age. Michael stepped closer. "What is that?" Emily turned it over. "I don't know." Then Michael noticed the markings. Tiny lines covered one side of the brass. At first they looked like scratches. They weren't. They had been made deliberately, fine calibration marks, small numbers, symbols, initials. Some were so faint they were almost impossible to see. Emily studied the surface. "Why would anyone put all of this on an instrument?" Michael didn't answer. He had no idea, and that made the object more interesting. They spent the next 2 hours examining it. Emily copied several of the markings into a notebook while Michael studied the instrument from every angle. The more carefully he looked, the stranger it became. There were tiny adjustments along one edge, marks that appeared to indicate changes in measurement rather than decoration. Michael traced one with his finger. "These aren't measurements for the piano." Emily looked up. "Then what are they for?" "I don't know yet." He turned the instrument over, then stopped. Something about its construction felt familiar, not the object itself. The memory of seeing something like it, years earlier. A work table near the cabin, brass pieces scattered across the surface, thin wooden tubes, hand-drawn measurements, and Walter standing beside Eleanor while she argued with him about the way the wind moved through the cabin. Michael closed his eyes. The memory was incomplete. But one word came back to him: wind. He opened his eyes. Emily was watching him. "What?" Michael shook his head. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, they took the brass instrument to Walter. He was sitting near the hospital window when they entered. Michael placed it on the table between them. Walter looked down. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then something changed in his expression. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition, almost affection. "You found it?" Michael watched him carefully. "What is it?" Walter reached toward the instrument but stopped before touching it. "Your grandmother had a name for it." Emily leaned forward. "What name?" Walter smiled faintly. "She called it her tuning gauge." Michael frowned. "Tuning what?" Walter looked toward the window, then back at them. The wind. Neither of them spoke. Walter finally touched the brass surface with one finger. "Your grandmother believed the cabin could make music without anyone playing the piano." Emily smiled. "That sounds like her." "It does." Walter's expression softened. "She spent years trying to make the idea work." Michael looked at the gauge. "Did it?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Michael. "You heard the melody during the storm." Michael nodded. Walter turned to Emily. "And you recognized it?" Emily nodded. Walter leaned back. "Then you already know more than I did when your grandmother first started building it." Michael waited. "What exactly did she build?" Walter glanced toward the window again. "A way for the cabin to remember." He didn't explain further. Not that afternoon. Walter told them only that Eleanor had spent years experimenting with the cabin itself. She studied airflow. She altered narrow passages inside the walls. She adjusted openings beneath the roof. She measured how different winds moved through the structure. The brass gauge had been part of that work. But whenever Michael asked for more, Walter stopped. Finally, Michael said, "You know more." Walter gave him a tired smile. "I know enough to know that some things are better discovered than explained." Michael didn't like the answer, but he knew his father. When Walter wanted to avoid a subject, pushing him only made him quieter. There was an old discipline to it, the same controlled silence Michael remembered from childhood. Walter had carried that habit home from the army years ago. Michael looked back at the instrument. The markings seemed more important now, not because they were mysterious, because they appeared to record years of work. "What are these?" Walter's eyes moved to the brass. "My wife." Michael looked at him. "What?" "Eleanor put them there." Michael studied the markings again. "Why?" Walter smiled sadly. "Because she wanted to remember what changed." That answer stayed with Michael. What changed? Not what happened. What changed? That evening, Michael and Emily returned to the cabin. The lake reflected the last orange light of sunset. Inside, they placed the brass gauge on the dining table. Emily opened her notebook. "Let's start with the marks." Michael sat beside her. They examined them one by one. Some were easy to read. Others had faded almost completely. One marking carried the date June 14th, 1968. Michael recognized it immediately. "That's their wedding anniversary." Emily wrote it down. Another corresponded to the year Michael was born. Another marked Walter's military deployment. Another appeared to coincide with a family tragedy. Another with a recovery. The marks weren't random, but they weren't a simple timeline either. Some years appeared more than once. Others were missing entirely. Emily looked over the notes. Maybe we're reading them wrong. Michael studied the gauge. How? I don't think these marks were meant to tell us when things happened. She touched one of the fine calibration lines. Look at how they're positioned. Michael leaned closer. Several markings appeared beside different measurement points. Some had been worn almost smooth. Others remained sharp. The more they examined them, the clearer one thing became. Eleanor hadn't simply engraved dates onto the brass. She had used the instrument repeatedly, over years, during different kinds of work, and somehow certain moments in her life had become attached to those measurements. Michael looked at Emily. She was recording more than the wind. Emily nodded. Maybe. They continued for another hour. Eventually, Emily noticed something unusual. Certain areas of the brass had been touched far more often than the rest. Not evenly, not by accident. The wear followed a subtle pattern across the instrument. Michael rotated it beneath the light. One marking seemed to correspond with another, then another. Not a chronological sequence. Something else. Emily ran her finger along the worn section. These were handled a lot. Michael nodded. More than the others. Why? He didn't answer. They kept studying the surface. There were no hidden compartments. No secret latch, nothing theatrical, just years of use recorded in brass. Then Emily noticed a shallow mark near the center. She almost missed it. It was so faint that it disappeared whenever the light moved. Wait. Michael looked up. What? Hold it there. He tilted the gauge toward the window. Nothing. He changed the angle. Still nothing. Then the setting sun struck the brass. A few shallow letters appeared. Emily went still. Michael. He saw them. Slowly, he rotated the instrument until the letters became clear. There was a date, then a short inscription beneath it. Michael read it once. Then again. His expression changed. Emily watched him. What does it say? Michael didn't answer. Because this wasn't another measurement. It wasn't another date connected to a family event. It was a sentence. And somehow, Eleanor had written it for whoever eventually found the gauge. Michael looked toward the door, then back at Emily. Suddenly, the brass instrument felt less like something they had discovered and more like something that had been waiting for them. Walter hadn't given Emily the key simply because he was ready to open the cabin. He had given it to her because he believed the time had finally come. Michael looked at Emily. We need to go back to Walter. Emily nodded. Neither of them knew what Eleanor's final message meant, but they both understood one thing. They were no longer trying to discover only how the cabin had made music. They were beginning to understand why Eleanor had wanted someone to hear it. For several seconds, neither Michael nor Emily spoke. The final inscription remained visible on the brass gauge as the afternoon light faded. It wasn't hidden. It hadn't been locked away. It had simply been waiting for someone to look closely enough. The words were short. When he comes back, let him choose the truth. Michael read them again. Then he lowered the gauge. For 18 years, he had believed he already knew the truth. Now he wasn't so sure. That night, Michael barely slept. Rain tapped softly against the cabin roof. The storm that had awakened the old melody was gone, but the sound of it remained in his mind. So did Eleanor's words. Let him choose the truth. For years, Michael had carried the same version of his mother's final years. She became ill. Walter shut him out. Decisions were made without him. Then the years passed and the distance became permanent. He had never questioned that story because eventually it stopped feeling like a story. It became memory. But now he understood something uncomfortable. Memory could be incomplete, and sometimes the part we remember most clearly is the part that hurt us. The next morning, Michael and Emily returned to the hospital. Walter looked tired, older than he had the day before. But when Michael entered the room, something in his father's expression changed. He knew. Michael placed the brass gauge on the bedside table. "You knew we'd find it." Walter's eyes settled on the inscription. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he closed his eyes and slowly exhaled. "Your mother knew." Michael pulled a chair closer. No more half answers. Walter opened his eyes. "All right." For the first time since Michael had returned, his father looked ready to tell him everything. "Your mother started getting sick nearly 20 years ago," Walter said. Michael remained silent. "At first, we didn't understand what was happening. She became tired easily. She forgot things. Some days she seemed perfectly fine. Other days, she could barely make it through breakfast." Walter paused. "She knew before we did that something was wrong." Michael lowered his eyes. He remembered those years differently now. The short phone calls, the canceled visits, the excuses he had been given. He had always believed Walter was creating the distance. "Why didn't you tell me?" Walter met his eyes. "I wanted to." The answer came without hesitation. "Your mother wouldn't let me." Michael's expression tightened. "Why?" Walter turned toward the window. "Because she didn't want your last memories of her to be hospital rooms." The room fell silent. Walter continued. "She knew what was coming. The treatments, the machines, the long nights, the days when she wouldn't look like herself." His voice weakened. "She didn't want you to remember her that way." Michael swallowed. "What did she want me to remember?" Walter's mouth lifted into a faint smile. "Her." Michael said nothing. Walter's eyes began to shine. "Birthday dinners, Christmas mornings, fishing trips, the piano." He paused. "The way she used to laugh when you played the wrong notes." A small smile appeared on Michael's face, despite himself. "I remember that." "I know." Walter looked down. "She wanted those memories to stay yours." Michael sat quietly. Then the question he'd carried for 18 years finally came out. "But what about me?" Walter looked up. "What about what I needed?" There was no anger in Michael's voice now. Only exhaustion. "I needed my mother." Walter nodded. "I know." "I needed to say goodbye." "I know." "I needed someone to tell me what was happening." Walter lowered his eyes. "I know." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 18 years. Michael turned toward the window. "So you just let me hate you." Walter was silent for a moment. Then he answered quietly, "I didn't let you." Michael looked back at him. "I carried it." The words stopped him. Walter rested his hands on the blanket. "Every year I thought about telling you, every birthday, every Christmas, every time I saw your name somewhere." His voice trembled. "I thought about calling." "Then why didn't you?" Walter glanced toward the brass gauge. "Because your mother asked me for one thing." Michael waited. Walter took a slow breath. "She said that if I chased you with my version of what happened, you'd hear my words." He looked directly at his son. "But if you ever came back on your own." Walter's voice softened. "You might finally be ready to hear hers." Michael looked down at the inscription. The sentence felt different now. "When he comes back, let him choose the truth." Eleanor hadn't asked Walter to hide the truth forever. She had asked him not to force it on Michael. The difference mattered. Michael's eyes filled with tears. For years he had believed Walter's silence was punishment. Now he was beginning to understand that it had also been sacrifice. That didn't erase the years. It didn't make the pain disappear. and it didn't return the time either of them had lost. "I lost so much time," Michael whispered. Walter nodded. "So did I." Neither man tried to correct the other. There was nothing left to defend. Emily had remained quiet through most of the conversation. Now she looked at the brass gauge. "And the melody?" Walter's expression softened. "That was your grandmother's other idea." Michael turned toward him. Walter smiled. "She wanted the cabin to remember her without keeping a recording of her." Emily frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Walter glanced toward the window. "Your grandmother believed the wind could do something a machine couldn't." He paused. "She could make the cabin carry her melody." Walter explained that Eleanor had spent years experimenting with the cabin itself. Inside the walls and beneath the roof were narrow wooden passages designed to guide air through carefully shaped chambers. Some passages ended near the original window openings. Others connected to small vents beneath the roof. The brass gauge helped Eleanor measure the airflow and make tiny adjustments. She wasn't simply building something that made noise. She was tuning the cabin, like a musical instrument. Michael listened carefully. "So the melody was always there?" "Not exactly." Walter shook his head. "The cabin could produce it only when the conditions were right." "Which conditions?" "Wind direction, pressure, temperature, the speed of the air." Walter glanced toward the gauge. "Your mother measured all of it." Michael looked at the engraved markings. "And the dates?" Walter touched one of them. "Those came later." "Later?" Once she knew the cabin could be tuned, she began marking the moments that mattered to her. Michael remembered the dates: their wedding anniversary, his birth, Walter's military deployment, a family tragedy, a recovery. They weren't a diary. They weren't a record of every year. They were markers. Moments when something in their lives changed. Michael looked at the gauge again. For the first time, he understood why Eleanor had put them there. She hadn't been trying to preserve everything. Only what she believed should never be forgotten. Michael looked toward Walter. "She was measuring more than the wind." A faint smile crossed Walter's face. "She always did that." Emily laughed softly. Walter joined her. For a few seconds, the room felt almost normal. Then Michael remembered the storm. If the cabin was designed to make music, why did it happen that night? Walter's expression became thoughtful. "It almost happened before." "Almost?" "Several times." He explained that Eleanor had tested the system for years. The conditions were simply too difficult to reproduce. The wind had to come from the right direction. The pressure had to change within a narrow range. The air had to move through the old channels at almost exactly the right speed. That combination was rare. Then came the storm. It brought unusually strong winds across Blackwater Lake. The pressure changed rapidly. Air found its way through the cabin's original openings and into the tuned chambers. And after 18 silent years, the structure responded. One note, then another. Then the melody Eleanor had spent years teaching the cabin to carry. Michael slowly nodded. The mystery finally had an explanation. But somehow, the explanation made the story more meaningful. Because the storm hadn't created Eleanor's melody. It had only recreated the conditions she had spent years trying to achieve. 3 days later, Walter asked Michael to return to the cabin. This time there was no secrecy, no locked door, no mystery waiting behind it. Workers were already there. They began carefully removing the old boards from the windows. Michael watched as each one came away. Beneath them were the original openings Eleanor had incorporated into the cabin's airflow system. For 18 years, they had remained covered. Now sunlight entered freely. Fresh air moved through the room. The cabin seemed to breathe again. Emily stood beside Michael. "Do you think it'll play?" Michael smiled. "I don't know." And for once, Neither of them needed to know. A cool breeze moved across Blackwater Lake. The trees along the shoreline began to sway. Everyone became quiet. Then, from somewhere inside the cabin, came a faint note. Michael looked up. Another followed, then another. The melody was simple, almost fragile, but Emily recognized it immediately. So did Michael. Eleanor's melody. No one applauded. No one spoke. They simply listened. Walter stood beside his son with his eyes closed. For a moment he seemed younger. Not because the years had disappeared, because for once he wasn't carrying them alone. Michael looked at his father. "I spent 18 years angry at you." Walter opened his eyes. "I know." Michael swallowed. "I think I finally understand why." Walter nodded. "But understanding doesn't give those years back." "No," Walter said. "It doesn't." They stood together in silence. Then Michael reached over and placed his hand on Walter's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but after 18 years, it was enough. The melody continued for a few more moments. Then the wind shifted. The final note faded across the lake. Michael didn't follow the sound. He stayed where he was, beside his father, because the mystery had never really been about how an old cabin could make music. It was about why someone would build that music in the first place. Eleanor had known that one day the cabin might be opened again. She had known someone might hear the melody. And perhaps she had understood something Michael had taken 18 years to learn. Some truths cannot be forced. They have to be chosen. The lake grew quiet. Walter looked at his son. Michael looked back. Neither man said anything. This time the silence meant something different. It wasn't rejection. It was peace. Some stories end with answers. The ones that matter most begin with understanding. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more untold stories. Until our next untold story, take care.